This episode of Transmission Interrupted was recorded August 12th, 2025. This is Transmission Interrupted, a podcast series from NETEC, the National Emerging Special Pathogens Training and Education Center. Welcome to Transmission Interrupted from NETEC.
Hello and welcome to Transmission Interrupted. My name is Jill Morgan. I'm an ICU nurse here at Emory University Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. For those of you not familiar with NETEC, our mission is to set the gold standard for special pathogen preparedness and response across health systems in the U.S. with the goals of driving best practices, closing knowledge gaps, and developing innovative resources. NETEC works alongside and in cooperation with the CDC and is funded by ASPR, the Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response. On today's episode, I'm really going to talk about two perspectives on preparedness that we probably need to spend a little bit more time with, and that's our friends in EMS and emergency medicine. So I'm really excited to talk today with Dr. Matt Sasser. He's the medical director at MedStar Transport and the medical director of Baltimore Ravens M&T Bank Stadium. He's also an emergency physician at MedStar Union Memorial Hospital. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Sasser.
Thank you so much. I very much appreciate it.
Yeah. And then I also have an old friend of mine, Dr. Alex Isakoff. Alex is the co-chair of the NETEC EMS work group. He's also the executive director for health security and a professor of emergency medicine here at Emory University Hospital in Atlanta. So thank you guys so much for being here. And I'm excited to talk about this. I think a lot of us in healthcare think all of that stuff that happens outside of the hospital and in our emergency rooms is stuff that, like keep it out of my ICU. I want all those things tidied up by the time they get to me. And there's an awful lot that happens down there that's very important in terms of preparedness and response, certainly in the identify, isolate, inform model, and really those steps towards preparedness that affect our entire communities and the folks that are going out and picking people up at their homes or businesses and bringing them in. So really excited that you guys are here to meet with me today. So let's just dive into this a bit. We're going to talk about what preparedness really looks like in an environment where the unexpected is your everyday. I think moving from being an ER nurse to being an ICU nurse, one of the best parts of that was that when you're in the ICU, nobody just comes and parks a patient in your hallway. It's not like, oh, you have a 20-bed ICU, here are 4 more patients, right? Just find a space. And yet that's the everyday version of most ER. So I think this idea that you just have to be ready for anything and everything is, I guess, an exciting part that brings people into the field, but also just such a huge challenge. So I'd really like to start, Matt, maybe with you and thinking about the big perspective on how EMS agencies and those of us in the hospital setting can really be thinking about being prepared for anything. What does that mean to you guys?
Yeah, I think that you started out exactly on point. I think that I realized early on that I could never work in a clinic. I could never sit there and do the exact same thing every day. I actually thrive on not knowing what's going to come through the door next. And I think that emergency medicine and EMS is the epitome of exactly that. So I think that, just like you mentioned, one of the most important things in EMS is to be prepared for anything, because we aren't isolated in hospitals. We're mobile medical units that not only have to respond to the calls that we already know are going to be coming our way, but we could get flagged down at any time as we're driving down the highway for anything that somebody may bring to us. It might be somebody who's sick or injured. We have to be able to take care of anything immediately. And that could be medical, it could be traumatic, be psychological, it could be any combination of those. And it doesn't always receive the recognition that fire and police do. EMS is really the backbone of the healthcare system, especially in the current system where every hospital cannot house every specialty. Those patients are routinely moved from one hospital to another. And very specifically for this, if there's a special pathogen patient, they're getting moved to a regional emerging special pathogen treatment center that can really take care of those patients. So I'm one of those people. I don't believe that we rise to the occasion. I believe that we fall back on our training. We aren't the specialists who focus on only one small area. We definitely need those people. I'm glad that they're out there, but having the breadth of knowledge that EMS clinicians do and the training that is required to make them always prepared, I mean, that's really the most important thing.
I love that. I love the idea. This is sort of a meta level. I think the Boy Scout motto is be prepared, right? So this is like a meta level of Boy Scouts, right? It's this idea of it's not just be prepared, it's be prepared for anything. And at any time, what you said about being flagged down, I mean, I don't think I had even really thought about that from yes, we're driving down the road, we're on our way to pick up lunch, and then we see something. It is huge psychological burden of how you go throughout that day. So thinking about the pieces that are required to be in place, you mentioned the importance of really being trained to respond to anything and that you fall back on your training. So a lot of us think about rising to the occasion, as you mentioned, but where we default to are those things that we get repetitive training about. And I think most of us hopefully have CPR training, for instance, and maybe you don't think about it, but then suddenly, if you're ever called on to do CPR, you know how quickly you do fall into that very routine, if you will, process and procedure, because it feels natural when you're in that situation to do it. And so it sounds like you guys have to put together an awful lot of pieces that are similar to that. And so one of the mantras we use that I think I probably learned it from Alex is this idea of staff, stuff, and space. And like, all right, so your space could be anywhere. How do you get people? How do you keep people trained to respond to anything? It just seems overwhelming.
Yeah, and that really comes down to the exercises that we perform. So between the exercises and the regular routine training that we do, that's really where the magic happens. So, exactly like you said, there are three main components to that. There's staff, there's space, and there's stuff. So staff is generally going to be your internal team for these kind of transports. We actually have a volunteer group within our own transport team, and that's going to be the staff that we are primarily concerned with. But we also have to take into account the staff of the sending facility, of the receiving facility. Everyone really has to be on the same page, which is why exercises are so important. Then you talk about the space. The space that we operate in EMS, it's much different than being in the hospital because you're not just dealing with your ICU. You're dealing with the sending hospital. You're potentially dealing with somebody's home that you're transporting from. You can deal with an airport, an airplane, a portable biocontainment unit. You could be talking about your own transport units as well as other EMS transport units. It's not always the same. And so exercising within your space is going to be super important. And one of the things that we are very fortunate with here in Region 3 is that between MedStar and Johns Hopkins Hospital, we have a great collaboration between our two facilities. We back each other up. And we're really excited about all of the training that we've done together. So now we've talked about staff, we've talked about space. Now we've got to talk about stuff. And the stuff is usually pretty straightforward. It's going to be your PPE that you're going to be very familiar with, unless you have that one group that is just not as familiar. And that's easy to address with just-in-time training. But there's other stuff that's also sometimes involved. For example, there are portable isolation units. So there could be a patient who's coming in an isopod that a team might not have trained with on a regular basis. And so it's really important to bring all of that together. And just as important as the staff, the space, and the stuff, with the exercises, you have to ensure that you have coordination between all of the key stakeholders, all of the people who are going to be involved. And then the most important part of all of this is once you're finished with your exercise, once you've gone through all of the iterations, is to do the after action report. Because with every exercise, it's all different, but it's all the same. Preparation, coordination, after action report, and learning from those lessons.
Yeah, so really an iterative process of making sure that people can pull those pieces together consistently, even with the differences that might be in place, right? You might be in a different place, but what you're being asked to do might be very similar to the things you've done regularly. Yeah, that's great. All right, so Alex, let's let you jump in here. So thinking from your perspective, you have a bit of a different background as far as your experience with special pathogens. And I'd love for you to just give folks a little bit of information about that if they don't know who you are and what you've done for EMS and us here at Emory. But then also philosophically, from your perspective, how you and your team prepare.
Sure, Jill. Well, I won't take a lot of time talking about this, but, since the inception of the isolation unit at Emory University Hospital, leadership, Bruce Ribner at that time reached out because he knew he needed an EMS partner. So that was 2001, 2002. So it's really been since then that I've been involved, working with partners in EMS to be best prepared to manage a patient that might have a serious communicable disease and have need for really strict infection prevention measures to be implemented to prevent exposure. And we've been doing that for quite a number of years until we had need to participate in the repatriation, transport, and management of a patient confirmed to have Ebola virus disease when they were brought back from West Africa to be treated in Atlanta. And, since then, that was really in great part some of the inception of NETEC, to have subject matter experts like you, Jill, in personal protective equipment and infection prevention, and like Matt and I for the EMS community, considering what the education and training should look like, what the policies and procedures should look like, participating in exercises and drills to maintain people's competencies, proficiencies to do this well, take care of patients with high consequence infectious diseases, transport them to where they have their best chance to get a full recovery. So that's been a lot of my work for close to 25 years. I think in terms of how do you get EMS personnel prepared to work in an environment where they may be exposed to someone who's infected with a special pathogen, maybe much like the way we've trained EMS personnel about assessing a trauma patient, you take some of that disorder and chaos and, what can be certainly, potentially a charged scenario, and you give, and this is true, EMS personnel in the emergency department, probably up in the ICU as well, a framework to think it through. So for trauma, that's like, okay, airway and breathing and circulation and disability and, get enough exposure to not miss an injury, and you have a framework for assessing the patient. I think for special pathogens, that's evolved into simply the identify, isolate, and inform paradigm, right? So, easy to remember, identify, isolate, and inform. It really captures the essential elements of protecting yourself and others around you while trying to provide care for the patient. So, identifying that someone could have a high consequence infectious disease because of their travel history, because of their signs and symptoms, isolating them in a way to protect the healthcare personnel or EMS personnel that are interacting with them from getting an inadvertent exposure to potentially infectious bodily fluids. And that goes to isolating them from others that might not be wearing the appropriate PPE and could be near the patient, putting them at risk. And then inform, letting others know of the risk, but also trying to get some assistance if that's what's needed. Also alerting the public health department and trying to take advantage of the resources that they may have, or your infection prevention team, or your infectious disease specialists. But that identify, isolate, and inform paradigm, I think, really helps EMS personnel and other frontline personnel get an understanding about what the essential elements are. And we can talk about this in as much detail as you want, but I think that paradigm of identify, isolate, and inform is important for all EMS personnel so that they can recognize a bio threat and take steps to prevent inadvertent exposure to potentially infectious bodily fluids. But if you're on a team that's dedicated to transporting and managing those patients, then of course there's a lot more education and training that's required, and there's an increased familiarization with policies and procedures that are intended to keep you safe as the caretaker of that individual while you're transporting them to where they need to be, doing it safely and keeping other people safe.
Yeah. I think something that I know I've heard you say before that I think is just such a great phrase, which is, it's basically your job to try not to be surprised, right? To have anticipated enough, to have trained enough that even a curveball is not that much of a surprise, right? So yeah, every situation's gonna be different, but you don't want to be having to think through an entirely new situation. It's because you've already had the training to kind of lay that groundwork. Where does it fit into that paradigm? And I think what you said is really interesting about really having a structure. As you said, ABCs, anybody who's taken CPR or, BLS has heard of some of those things, but the whole ABC through exposure, through all the pieces that we do, that helps you reduce that. I think the healthcare human factors, people say this, it's the cognitive burden, right? If I have a structure, then I don't have to jump around or worry I missed something because I'm going through it in a systematic way. And I really like kind of looping what you mentioned about that back to one of the things that Dr. Sasser said, which is drills and exercises help us prepare for these things. I think sometimes those folks on the receiving end, right? I spent most of my career not being one of the people who plans a drill or exercise, but just being the one that's thrown the curveball, right? Like I'm the one who just happens to be there the days that happens. And those things can feel so stressful. They can feel like you're personally being tested or you're being graded in some way. And yet, I think, Matt, what you said was so important, this idea of it's all about the after action report. It's all about what you learn from the process, right? So if we're doing something and gosh, this handoff site doesn't work, or I can't stay in this PPE this long. I mean, those are such important things to learn on the front end. So nobody suffers on the back end when you're in a real life situation.
Yeah, Joe, I think you're right. We provide a lot of education and training to EMS personnel and people that are working in emergency medical services on special pathogens and caring for patients to develop, obviously, a knowledge base and develop some muscle memory, right? So that when you're faced with what could be a stressful situation, that muscle memory is going to serve you well in caring for the patient. I think, there's another cliche, but it's appropriate here. I think that's why we also try to train as you fight or fight as you train, so that you try to eliminate the artificiality if you can, so that you're really teaching people to react to what should be real life circumstances, right? And this is where the exercises are really important, because then you actually practice it and you realize maybe where the education and training is falling short or where a procedure needs to be modified. I mean, that's really invaluable. Last thought on this for me is I think the importance of providing that foundational education and training so that when you are faced with something a little atypical, a little unusual, you can actually critically think through it based on, for example, your understanding of disease transmission and infection prevention. Like if we just teach, EMS personnel some rote protocol without the personnel having an understanding about why things are done the way they are, then when something becomes a little unusual, presents a little bit differently, I think you're in it'll be a lot more challenging to navigate out of that trouble and do it safely. If you can critically think through these things because you have the understandings, the fundamentals of infection prevention, critically important for critical thinking.
I think that's great. I certainly know as a learner, I appreciate knowing sort of why behind what you're asking me to do. So I think that I absolutely understand that point. I want to ask, because, you both have been involved in so many big exercises and drills. Matt, you mentioned the portable biocontainment units, isopods. Can you kind of share some of the maybe interesting or surprising or maybe just the most current things you've learned from drills and exercises from your point of view? And Matt, I'll let you go first on that, but just, is there something that's happened either with the Ravens or at MedStar or with the portable biocontainment unit that you think is a good lesson for other people to hear about?
Yeah, sure. There's no shortage of great lessons out there. So I'm going to try to be brief with just a few of these. But I do want to just kind of mention that I love the fact that you use the term curveball, because it's one that my team hears all the time, because I love to throw curveballs to them. And they know that even if they do everything absolutely perfect, at the end of the scenario, I'm going to say, but what if this happened? And what if that happened? And I think that's really beneficial, because trying to find those gaps in a safe space, I think that's always going to be the most beneficial. And like Alex said, identifying that ahead of time is going to make people much more comfortable if they ever encounter that in a real life situation. So, I think that one of the best phrases that I've ever heard is never let a good disaster go to waste. So I would say that in terms of exercises and training, we did have the opportunity to have a tropical storm come by at one point, and I happened to be in our ready room getting all of our equipment ready. And I said, well, wait a second, it is an absolute downpour out here. Nobody's ever really weather tested all of our PPE. So I donned all of our PPE. I stood out in a monsoon. I stood under an overflowing water spout. So I had a nice waterfall on me for a good 10 minutes. I went over, stood in 6 inches of water, came out, doffed all of my PPE, came out bone dry. The PAPR never faltered. I think that, that's one of those exercises that you don't know it until you try it. And I think that it was a really good test of our PPE. So it really gave our team a lot of confidence.
I love just that image of you going out, who is that standing in the parking lot? That's Dr. Sasser.
Yeah, happy to get you pictures if you like. But yeah, and so talking about the exercises, so we actually were privileged enough to run 2 exercises at Washington Dulles International Airport, which is one of the areas that has a CDC substation where any potential patients who are going to come through their point of entry. And so we did 2 different exercises, one that was more focused between us, Johns Hopkins, and the airport itself. And that went very smoothly. You got to know all of the players. You got to know all of the methods. And then after that, we did the larger Tranquil Passport exercise, which was a large international multi-jurisdictional exercise. And one of the things that we figured out was that when you get that many people involved, it all of a sudden, number one, becomes a lot more complicated. Number two, it actually becomes harder to perform those drills because you've got observers who are going to be watching. They're going to be interrupting the original timeline. And all of this is really important in terms of being able to watch the actual methods, but it does certainly slow things down in terms of the actual exercise itself. Having gone through all of the after action plans and evaluations for that, one of the things that we figured out is that when you do an exercise as large as Tranquil Passport and you get through all of the hurdles, we are very confident that when it comes time to do a real transport, we're going to be much smoother, much faster, and much more cohesive. I think that one of the other things that we kind of learned during Tranquil Passport is that we had everything planned out ahead of time. We had all of the information we knew about the patients. And one of the things that we kind of found ourselves questioning along the way was, wait, am I supposed to know about this piece of information yet? Do I need to call about this? And again, it introduces a level of artificiality that would not be real in a true scenario. And again, it just kind of gives us confidence that if we were in the real scenario, we're going to be much more confident, much more smooth, and we're going to have everything laid out exactly as we want it. So I think that that's just a great example of how an exercise actually benefits our reality.
Yeah, I think that exercise in particular, because it was so enormous and complex, it felt like if you can do that one, pretty much the other ones are going to look much more manageable. Now, of course, having said that, you're in a big metropolitan area. We're here in Atlanta. I know Alex was working in EMS, for instance, during the Olympic Park bombings in Atlanta. And, some of these other big events where suddenly your world can be turned upside down and even large scale drills and exercises can start to look like maybe they're not quite aggressive enough. Unfortunately, our world is something where a pathogen could come to us on an airplane filled with kids returning to college. And now we have kids scattered across the country who all got exposed to something. I mean, you start to think about our capacity and our training and again, sort of going back to the staff stuff in space and thinking about, do we have enough? Have we trained enough? I'd really like to hear Alex first, of course, give you an opportunity to talk and give us an anecdote about training, but also thinking about what does success look like? What counts as success in this sort of area of our business?
Well, I can answer that, I think, up front in the most simple terms. A successful mission is one where we've provided compassionate care for the patient and nobody got hurt. It was all done safely, right? I mean, that's the bottom line. That's absolutely true for HCID, right? High consequence infectious disease patient transports and management. It's true for really, anything we do in emergency medical services. You want to be able to provide compassionate care, get the patient to the right place in the right amount of time. And you want to be able to do that safely, right? That's a successful day. That's a successful mission. In terms of anecdotes, one thought I always have carried, and it's from experience, is that you can't do something the first time without learning something about it, right? And so I think, as it relates to developing procedures, you really want to try that procedure out during a drill, during an exercise, find out where the gaps are and fix them, because you're always going to find something. I think we've all been tempted, and we've probably done it, where we make a decision on the fly, even during a mission or an operation, and it's a little different than the way we've done it before. And I think we could probably all recount where we had to navigate out of some of the trouble that caused, because you can't do something the first time and not learn about it. And so I think that's really the value of the drills and exercises. In the context of scale, I guess, right, for an incident, this is always going to be a challenge. We're ready for one patient, two patients at a time. I think Tranquil Passport exercise was testing a lot of us on what it might look like to have need to transport and manage several patients, and in different age groups, adults and pediatrics. And even then, this was an excellent exercise to test out a new capability, the portable biocontainment unit that Asper has fielded. But even that was pretty modest in terms of the number of patients that were needing to be managed. And if we start thinking about serious communicable disease, high consequence infectious disease, and we're talking about high mortality or morbidity associated with the illness and dozens or hundreds of patients, that's much more daunting. Even in a national effort, is going to be much more daunting. And some of the challenge is that there's always competing priorities for people's time, competing priorities for people's resources. There's always a risk assessment. Well, what's the likelihood that something like this is going to happen? And a lot of what we prepare for might be low likelihood, but is really high consequence. And I think that's important. My thought on how you keep a better prepared nation in this regard, I think follows a lot of what we've seen since the West African Ebola outbreak and our level of preparedness in the United States. There has been a fairly steady stream of funding to maintain capabilities and capacity for these patient managements at 13 regional special pathogens treatment centers around the United States, and at least 13 EMS agencies that are supporting those regional special pathogens treatment centers, although we know there are many more. And having funding to maintain that capability and capacity, not just so that they can take care of 3 critically ill patients per center, that's still a pretty small number, but you're maintaining the clinical subject matter expertise, and you're maintaining the expertise that maintains those policies and procedures that are needed to manage those patients and do it safely, right? To have a good day, to have success in the mission that you're embarking in. And so that continued funding, I think, is critically important for our level of preparedness. If you shut it off, those clinical subject matter experts, they have to pursue other work, and those policies and procedures get stale. And the people that we're counting on to make patient contact, do it safely, take care of the patient, transport them to where they need to be, and then have them managed in the hospital, which is more complex than what we're doing in the pre-hospital setting, the proficiencies wane. So, that's my pitch to maintaining funding, to maintaining not just the capacity, but the subject matter expertise that's required to keep it up to date.
Yeah, no, I think those are great points. I think, you mentioned you don't want to do something the first time when it counts, right? I mean, I was thinking about Matt's baseball analogies of throwing a curveball at his team to make sure they could sort of, adjust. But a major league pitcher doesn't go into a new stadium and throw cold, right? they warm up in the bullpen. Then when they get up there, they throw a few warm-up pitches before they're actually throwing that first pitch for real. And I think we need to keep groups of people thinking about these things and practicing these things and really investing that time and energy into this, because you need somebody to be the first at doing this. And we can learn from each other, right? We can learn like, okay, look, I'm just telling you, it doesn't work to do it that way. We need to pivot. So I think that that's so important that we do maintain this level of expertise, as you said, readiness, willingness to learn, learning new pieces of equipment and new processes and new devices like this portable life containment unit. So I think that, to me, preparedness is really that idea of safety for our teams being paramount. That's what mission success looks like. And we do that by practice. We do that by training and by being just diligent and learning from each time we do this stuff. I'm so glad to talk with you guys today. And I want to give you the opportunity to really give me any last important thoughts. Alex, you did a great job really emphasizing that this is something that takes a level of resources and a level of investment that is important to the actual success of this. And by success, we do mean the health and welfare of our teams and our communities.
Yeah, Jill, I think that's right. Closing thought, I think for the sustainability of this enterprise of caring for patients with high consequence infectious disease, we just need to continue to cultivate that community of practice. Whether it's among EMS personnel working in the out-of-hospital setting, or frontline personnel, whether they be in a clinic or an emergency department, or at a tertiary care center like Washington Hospital Center, Emory University Hospital, you're represented on this call, that can care for these patients through their most critical phase of illness with all the critical care resources needed to keep them alive and give them their best chance at a full recovery. We got to cultivate that community of practice, because there's always turnover in this business, right? For one. And as you bring more communities on board, health systems on board, EMS agencies on board, you're bringing younger people into this enterprise, and they learn from people that have been in the business for a couple dozen years, and you just maintain that healthy evolution of the community of practice so that you never lose the clinical subject matter expertise, the procedural expertise, the experience that's needed to do this safely. It's always there. You're cultivating that community of practice. And I think that's what we aspire to do in the NETEC EMS work group, and through our EMS Biosafety Transport Consortium and the outreach, education, and training that all the regional centers are doing in their regions, is cultivating the community of practice. It's critically important for sustainability and to be able to have a successful day, Jill. Take good care of the patients and do it safely. Nobody gets hurt.
Yeah, thanks. All right, Matt, any last thoughts?
I think Alex wrapped it up really well. I mean, I think that preparation is the key, and the key to preparation is, having the funding and the time and the people who are able to do it. We have a saying at our biocontainment unit: slow, careful, safe. So we want everyone to go home. So that's one of the first rules of EMS. Everybody goes home. And without the preparation, without the training, without the funding to make sure that this happens, what is the alternative? Well, the alternative is that a potential special pathogen does get out of containment, does spread throughout the population, and the results could be devastating. So that's why I always try to prepare my team as best as possible. That's why so many members of my team volunteer to be part of the special aspect of the special pathogen team, so that they are always prepared. They are always in the know of exactly what is potentially out there. Because without that, then again, there's a concern for the entire country in terms of where this might go. So my hat's off to everybody who is part of a special pathogen team, both in the hospital as well as EMS. I think that it's all super important, and I'm happy to be part of this amazing group. I would also reiterate all of the great resources that are on NETEC for EMS. There are a lot of areas that I would highly recommend both in the hospital and EMS teams to check out. So looking forward to potentially also bringing more people onto our team.
Excellent. And I'm actually going to piggyback on that and say that I think a lot of our hospital-based healthcare providers really suffered during COVID and really suffered with lack of PPE or lack of knowledge about how to use PPE. And of course, as everybody knows on here, PPE is one of my favorite subjects. But this is an opportunity, whether you work at a regional treatment center or are in a frontline facility somewhere. The more informed you are, the better trained you are, the more you know about the pieces you have, whether it's a respirator, a gown, a process for identify, isolate, and form. The more we do this, the more we practice this, the safer we are, the better we can use those devices and tools to keep ourselves safe. And that is, as you guys have both said, it's keeping not only that healthcare provider safe, but it's keeping their family, their community, their other patients safe. And that's really, at the end of the day, we went into this business to help care for people. Nobody wants to make someone else sick. I don't want that to be my kid. I don't want that to be my spouse. I don't want that to be my neighbor. I don't want it to be the next patient I'm going to see. So to me, I hope that people feel empowered by knowledge and empowered by these trainings and drills and exercises, not to feel like they're being judged or criticized or graded, but they're being brought up to a level of functioning that's going to give them the best chance at success. So I really thank you guys. It's so interesting to hear different perspectives about this. And I think it's just, to me, very, very valuable that we all work towards that ideal of being better prepared, not being surprised by anything, and really being ready for whatever comes next. Well, thank you guys so much, Dr. Matt Sasser, Dr. Alex Isakoff. I just am so grateful for being able to talk with you today about all of these special circumstances that we need to be prepared for. So for those of you listening at home, thank you for tuning in to this episode of Transmission Interrupted. We hope you'll join us for future episodes on a wide range of topics, from healthcare worker safety to personal protective equipment, of course, and more about infectious diseases and EMS and infection prevention. If you have any questions for NETEC or ideas for future shows, please feel free to contact us at info@netec.org. That's info@netec.org. You can also find us on the web at netec.org/podcast, or you can, of course, subscribe to future episodes and find out more about today's topic and some links to some of the resources that Dr. Sasser just mentioned. So thank you so much. Thank you to my guests, and we'll see you next time on Transmission Interrupted.
You've been listening to Transmission Interrupted, a NETEC podcast, produced and edited by Benjamin Madsen, with additional support provided by Britton Clark, Veronica Lavaro, Jason Noble, and Lisa Stone. Special thanks to our guests and the subject matter experts at NETEC for their insight and guidance. This podcast is supported by the Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response. For more information, tools, and training on special pathogen preparedness, visit netec.org. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and share the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for tuning in to Transmission Interrupted.